Matthew and Anna, you are both working in the field of climate change and health. Can you each start by telling me a little bit more about your background and what led you to this field? So we'll start with Anna and then move to Matthew.
Hey, great. Thank you. So my background is a medical doctor, and I've taken a rather meandering career. So I was interested in all sorts of medical specialties, but always with this sort of clear indication that I was very interested in the environment from a very early age. And I did my training in anaesthetics and intensive care, which gave me a very strong grounding in physiology and sort of understanding our responses to the environment, and completed a master's in epidemiology. And then I went on to do my PhD looking at the impact of heat on maternal and fetal physiology, kind of combining all of my interests together, and working in an area which is particularly hit by the climate crisis.
Thanks, Rebecca. I'm Matthew Chersich. Like Anna, I was a medical doctor, but I haven't practiced for some decades. And initially, so I'm from South Africa, and initially I worked on HIV, particularly HIV transmission in pregnant women, and then some work on maternal health and newborn health. But around 7 years ago, while I was living in the rural areas of Italy, I moved to study climate change and health with an emphasis on heat. And like Anna, focused on exposure of pregnant women to high temperatures, initially looking at the impact of, how does heat affect the pregnant woman and the fetus and the newborn, but increasingly moving towards looking at what are the solutions. How do we try and solve some of these problems and protect this really vulnerable population?
Yeah, thanks so much for sharing that. So Matthew, as you've been discussing, we're specifically focusing on the intersection between extreme heat events and maternal and newborn health. Why are these populations particularly vulnerable to heat compared to others?
So Rebecca, that's a good question. And I think we should emphasize that the vulnerability of pregnant women and fetuses, newborns, to heat is particularly relevant in low and middle income countries. In higher income countries, there's a focus on the elderly or those or on homeless people, etc. So we're really talking about a pregnant woman in countries where there's already high levels of vulnerability, and often you have increased social vulnerability during pregnancy and diminished ability to work and to gather resources, etc. So you're compounding some biological vulnerability as well, where during pregnancy women are less able to dissipate heat, and often they have to continue with the current physical labor, such as collecting wood or collecting water, etc. And then I think one of the most key questions is what happens to women during childbirth and during labor and childbirth, where there's a very large amount of heat generated by the physical exertion of labor, and many of the facilities where women have childbirth have very little protection against heat. They really are the built environment is not suitable to protect these women, and in some places there isn't even water, let alone cold water. So you're having a 10-hour, somewhat of what you might call a marathon, without in extremely high temperatures with no. And I think maybe just to conclude, the fetus is around 0.5 degree warmer than the mother throughout pregnancy, and the fetus has really no ability to thermoregulate, and it's a highly vulnerable period, as we all know. So I think the fetal exposures are also really, really important.
Thank you. And then over to Anna. Firstly, do you have anything else to add? And secondly, to play a little bit of devil's advocate, Matthew's just said it is a problem for LMICs. Is this true, or is there any evidence to say that there is a universal global problem, or maybe in future?
Yeah, just to add to Matthew's points, which I completely agree with, that I think, ultimately there is this biological vulnerability that comes with pregnancy, and specifically in terms of sort of fetal development. But it's very much a cultural, societal problem as well. And the intersectionality of this means that you can't just think of it as there is going to be no one simple solution kind of moving forward to kind of take away the heat and then move, everything is going to be fine. And as with so many other things in terms of health, the social determinants of health, poverty, the inequalities within the societies, gender inequality plays a massive role in the vulnerabilities to this, to the impacts of heat and the impacts of climate change. So just to say that ultimately, I think I agree with Matthew completely in that the majority of women who are exposed and are extremely vulnerable to the impacts of heat are in LMICs and sort of live in this sort of tropical, subtropical region. However, we do know that most of the kind of large-scale environmental epi studies, Matthew's done a very thorough systematic review and meta-analysis, and most of those papers actually have come from high-income countries. And pretty much, I think we can now say that the evidence is very strong to show that globally, in high-income countries as well as in lower-income countries, we see this effect on pregnant women where you have an increased risk of adverse birth outcomes from being exposed to high levels of heat. So although I think the kind of, because of the ubiquity of the exposure in certain regions and the vulnerabilities due to other factors, yes, the most at-risk women are from LMICs, but that doesn't mean that high-income women are not at risk also.
If I could just pick up on that point briefly, I think Anna's completely right. And there are now around 200 studies that show that heat exposure or high temperatures or heat waves in pregnancy are harmful to maternal and newborn health. And most of those are certainly from high-income countries, because that's where the large databases exist. And even in some countries that you consider temperate, like Sweden or in Canada or some of those countries which people think are traditionally cooler, they also have heat. The heat there is also dangerous during pregnancy. So I think that's a good point.
Yeah, and as you both discussed, it's extremely complex. It's not a black and white issue with just, you can't easily categorize these things, and there's a lot of thinking to be done. I mean, so until recently, and maybe not even now, you might argue, maternal and newborn health has been missing from the climate change agenda. Do you have any opinions on why you think that is?
Because we live in a patriarchy.
Okay.
Is that controversial?
I mean, I might think that a lot of climate change has so far been focused on the global north, and a lot of the evidence on heat vulnerability, like I said earlier, was around the elderly or people with chronic diseases, or perhaps people who are obese, etc. And even the global indicators are often around heat impacts in people above 65 years old. And in Africa, the life expectancy is 65 years old, so it's clearly not a good indicator. So I think it's largely because of the absence of evidence on pregnant women in low and middle income countries, and the fact that so much of the research has been done in the global north. And there's really, until recently, there were only a handful of people working on heat and health in low and middle income countries in climate change, whereas you had several thousands of researchers on this topic in the global north. And knowledge follows researchers, and money, sadly.
And Anna, I do want to pick up, because you did say patriarchy, and I think there is something to be said for women's health generally missing from agendas. That I work on this day to day, and I do see it. So did you want to say anything more about that, or anything you think he added?
I agree with Matthew. I think probably there is a lot to do with the kind of where the research is being led, and obviously the global north is where the money is, and they're the ones that get to set the agenda. But women's health and women's issues have been lacking for many, many years. I mean, there's so many stark examples of this, and it's only really coming to light that actually you can't take what is found to work or be risk factors for men and apply it to women. And so I think I think there is an element of that. And I think, you know, pregnant women are notoriously difficult to study because you have complex ethical dilemmas around any kind of interventions. And so people just don't want to go there. And so I think that has also happened to an extent.
Could I maybe add, and I think Ana showed this very clearly in her work in the Gambia, is that often there's patriarchy, or there's certainly gendered work, outdoor work in rural, particularly in rural areas where work such as agriculture, or like I mentioned earlier, collection of firewood, or of water, and indoor cooking, whereas again it's often really warm, and those are seen as women's activities, and all of those are associated with heat generation or heat exposure outdoor, and childcare, for example, is quite a laborious, takes a lot of energy and so on, and men often will not get involved in those tasks. So there is certainly some gendered aspect here around work.
Yeah, that's a really, really interesting point around the gendered aspect of the work. And I hope we can come on to that later. I'm going to go back to Ana. You were just talking around it can be difficult to study these populations, particularly pregnant women. And yet you have been doing a lot of work to quantify and highlight the scale of the problem when it comes to heat events and pregnancy and other vulnerable populations. Can you talk me through the evidence you've generated so far, both recent work that you've done on stillbirth and anything else that you think is pertinent to say?
Sure. So this was a sort of expert review where we took Matthew's previous work and then looked at any sort of more recent studies that have been published. And what was interesting is that there's been a bit of a growth in studies covering this, especially studies coming from lower middle income countries. And I think now we can say that there is quite clear evidence from both high income countries and lower middle income countries that there is an adverse effect of heat on the risk of stillbirth. So in all of the studies, in 19 out of 20 of the studies, we found this increased risk of stillbirth with heat exposure. Now, the heat exposure is something that has been defined differently in different studies. So it becomes very difficult to try to get a single measure that you can say, this is the threshold above which women are at risk, and apply that to a global population. And that's something that Matthew and I struggle with in our work going forward. But I think the sort of evidence base is coming together to show that it doesn't really matter where you are. If you're exposed to very high temperatures, wherever you are at increased risk. And so that's kind of like bringing together the sort of global epidemiological literature showing this sort of large scale impacts on big databases. And our work in the Gambia is really much more sort of small scale, I guess, at the moment, because we've been looking at what is the physiological response of pregnant farmers to the heat exposure, how they physiologically respond, how their fetuses respond, and exploring that in some more detail to try and understand the lived experience of the women, what techniques they use to try and avoid the heat. So we're on the pathway to try and explore this in more details, but we have quite a lot of extensive work coming up, which hopefully will shed some more light on it.
And this is where I'll come to you, Matthew, because obviously part of High Horizons is kind of trying to understand some of these thresholds and measuring mitigation on this global scale. But you're also a co-lead on Chandler and the work that's going on there, which has obviously built some of the foundations for the High Horizons work. So can you talk through what evidence has been coming out of your work to demonstrate the risk of heat for mothers and babies?
Excellent, thanks, Rebecca. So in Chandler, we've done quite a few things, and all with interesting findings. So quantitatively, we looked at questions of heat exposure and on breastfeeding duration, for example, and there we showed quite a considerable decrease in duration of breastfeeding as temperature rises, and also quite interesting findings around the impacts of heat on things like pregnancy induced hypertension. So those were quite nice low middle income countries databases, some of the first analyses showing that. Then some of the qualitative work in Kenya and Burkina Faso try to really understand, like Anna was saying, women's lived experiences. What does it mean to be living in very warm environments and be pregnant and taking account of all the social determinants and the other parts of their lives? And that's really rich data, I think. So that's trying to understand the impact. But of course, as researchers, we're far more interested in how does one intervene to lower those impacts. And there were two quite interesting, the interventional studies. The one in Kenya, in the rural area of Kenya, in the coast province, we intervened with a small group of pregnant women who were doing a lot of outdoor labor, which we discussed earlier. And we tried to shift some of the cultural norms around that to change the kind of work they were doing, or the times of day that work was being done, but also to get other women involved or men to assist with the outdoor labor, so that especially in the third trimester of pregnancy, that kind of really intense heat exposure was diminished. And those findings seem very promising. So I think those are useful steps in Chamna. They're single interventions, which I'm sure Anna will agree that such a complicated set of exposures and of outcomes requires probably a more intense interventions than these kind of single simple interventions. But what Chamna showed is that there is scope for changing practices, behaviors, and protecting women, but that probably this needs to be taken further with much more intensive interventions.
And I think it's really interesting listening to both of you about specific challenges that exist in specific communities that maybe I would never even think about. Pregnant farmers, for instance, like it went into my sphere of day-to-day life. And obviously what the interventions you bring into place are going to be so different depending on someone's context. So yeah, I want to hear more about these interventions from both of you, and what do you know, what already existing solutions are there, both in terms of behaviour change, as you've just discussed, but also what can hospitals do, or infrastructure, those sorts of things. What do we already know that helps?
And this is a tough one. I'll leave this question to you.
I was wondering with this awkward pause. But I think actually we don't know very much. And that is why Wellcome has made one of their priority calls last year was all about heat interventions, because the evidence base behind a lot of the things that we think of as common sense haven't yet been studied to have a look if they actually have a long-term health outcome. So although some places have put in early warning systems, for example, that sort of seems to be quite a sort of established thing to do, actually linking that then to a maternal health outcome has not happened as yet. So I think there's some evidence from Pakistan and India of community health workers doing some educational and behavioral interventions, a bit like what Matthew's been talking about, in terms of awareness around heat, changing work patterns, perhaps changing the timing that you do the cooking, moving from indoor cooking to an outdoor sort of shaded area of cooking that has been effective in terms of reducing the heat exposure. But to then take that a step further and link it to a hard health outcome, as far as I'm aware, is still lacking, which is why our new projects, so we're both involved in different projects going forward about intervention studies, are so exciting, because really it's a kind of, at the moment, it's quite an unknown area.
But, and I'm a bit surprised, because there is a very simple answer to this question, is that cooling areas, that air conditioning is the way that the global north has answered that question. So Rebecca, if you'd asked someone who lives in Canada or America, they would have given you a one-line answer to say, no, we just turn the air conditioning on. And of course that's problematic. That's quite problematic, and it's the the low and middle income countries don't have access to that. So you're landing up with these large thermal inequities where the pregnant women are now having to rely on quite simple interventions. And that might be things like white reflective paint on the roof, some of these behavioral changes. Perhaps we can have cool water in health facilities during labor, or perhaps a church hall that has an air conditioning. So some rational use of air conditioning, and the built environment, and of course there's nature-based solutions. So we do have. So I think I might disagree with Anna here, that I think we probably don't have the evidence, but we have the sufficient knowledge and to I think move at this point. So even though there isn't evidence, I think there won't be for some for years or decades, and I think we just have to. We don't have the luxury of waiting for that evidence. We really just need to move at this point. Otherwise, those inequities, those thermal inequities, will just increase further and further. Where as the temperature rises and as the global north just installs more billions of air conditioners, you'll just get it in this massive gap, and that's just not sustainable ethically and from a human rights. And in fact, from there's mass migrations which will happen. So no one wins by us not acting at the moment and vigorously acting.
Yeah, I agree with you, Matthew, totally. I found it quite shocking. There was a paper out a couple of years ago showing the link, like millions of birth outcomes in the States linked to heat, and showing increased risk of preterm birth, I think it was. And the answer was people need to use more air conditioning units. And like, that's to me completely insane when you think about the people who are at risk. I guess what my answer to that was in a realistic, pragmatic, sustainable solutions maybe have not yet been completely developed. But I think, definitely it's the time to act is now. And ultimately we know that people need to be cooled. So how you go about doing that is what's not known, but really that is what needs to happen.
So in terms of what you're currently working on, is there anything that you'd like to speak about in terms of interventions? And also speaking through, you say about air conditioning units, obviously they come with a carbon cost in themselves. There are obviously probably ways like solar panels you could make them a bit better, but how important is that these solutions are also carbon neutral? So if I go to Matthew and then I'll come to you, Anna.
Yeah, so I think Rebecca, maybe the one thing to highlight is that our new work, and I think Anna's as well, is to try and look at more complex interventions where you have multi-level. So you might have an intervention at the individual, at the household, the community, some policy intervention. So multi-level, but also multi-component, where you're trying to intervene behaviorally in the built environment, nature-based solutions, and some societal solutions. And the one that I'm particularly fascinated by at the moment is some financing or some cash transfer during the heat wave, or perhaps even just during the summer or the warm season. Sorry, some of the more interesting interventions, the more intensive interventions, and something I think that the field really needs to move towards is to say that we have probably what we might call first level interventions that will probably manage to maintain a relatively thermoneutral environment for pregnant women under current temperature exposures. If implemented at scale, they will probably help to reduce health morbidities given current temperature exposures. But what we need is second level interventions to cope with the temperatures that are coming in the next 5 to 10 years. At the moment, none of what I'm calling first level interventions will have any nearly sufficient level of effectiveness to cope with the temperatures we will shortly experience. And that's a major problem. A sentence like that means really mass mortality or really major numbers of fetal and maternal health morbidity or stillbirth, etc. And that's something I think the world we haven't really thought through. We don't know what to do at the current levels of heat, like Anna pointed out, and we certainly have no idea what to do when it's 55 degrees in an urban slum in Nairobi.
Over to you, Anna.
Yeah, so I think, as Matthew said, our work is a little bit similar. So we're all sort of part of this new cohort from Wellcome. So we're going to be using co-design to decide on what the interventions should be. And we're sort of planning on a cluster randomized controlled trial based in Pakistan, in both urban sort of slum settings and rural settings, anticipating that the interventions in the two areas will be quite different. But at the moment, and there will be a component which will be structural and hopefully some may be nature-based, but obviously with the constraints within like grants, you have only 4 years, so you can't like wait until the trees have grown. Some behavioral and some kind of community level interventions, but we really don't know. It's quite exciting to kind of take it to the people who are there to kind of get buy-in from the whole community and then see what comes out.
And actually, we've only got a couple of minutes left, and it's a perfect time to kind of end on the question around how important is it to have co-design with the communities involved, and how are you both doing that in your work? I'll start with you, Anna, then on to Matthew for the final word.
So this study very much is co-designed. The one in Pakistan is going to be completely and utterly led by a kind of community participatory engagement. The work in the Gambia, we've done a lot of kind of different aspects to our community engagement. So we've led some schools engagement projects where we kind of give them the opportunity to come up with solutions for the environmental and climate related problems that they identify are important to them. And so I would like to take some of these findings forward into thinking about what sort of interventions we try out in the future. Thanks.
So, I think you're asked to end on a note that perhaps quite a challenging note. And I think I understand the need for co-design, and I'm not diminishing that, but I think it comes with a lot of drawbacks. It takes a really long time, and it also there's a balance between what we know about the science and what the community feels is often going to be most effective. So I'm not diminishing the need for co-design, but equally I'm not convinced that doing rapid, short, intensive interventions, carefully tested, isn't an important way to go. I think the field is all really advancing this co-design idea, and I understand why, and I'm sure that has been effective in many fields. But equally, I think there's not enough people saying, let's go into a community and let's do some rapid, quick tests of diverse interventions at scale and with high quality outcome measures. So while I agree with Anna, I also think this is an unanswered question. Maybe the best approach is, given the amount of evidence and the speed with which we need it, to do some rapid interventions, test some novel things out. So I'm unsure what the correct way forward is.
I think we might be about to cut off, so that's an excellent point to end on, with a challenge to the community about what can we do for the future and how can we think about this more. Thank you both so much for your time. It has been really fascinating, and I'm really grateful that you've taken the time to talk to me.